Hey everybody, what's up? It's Booksy. Today is Saturday, January 22nd. This is going to be an update for AMC's chart on Friday, January 21st. But I'm also going to talk about the macro view today. I'm going to do something a little different, which is that I'm going to present to you what I actually personally think. None of this is financial advice. It's just for education purposes. And I'm going to share with you what I think may or may not occur. Well, I think what may occur. I think there's only really a couple options in my mind at this particular point in time. And I'm going to talk about the macro playing out, like what I think would could happen. I've been reluctant to talk about this mainly because we're in sort of shifting sands, right? So as things have changed and developed this year, towards the end of the year and into the new year, the market turned really, really bearish. And also, with the way that YouTubers tend to overemphasize or hyperbolize these moves and stuff, I'm not saying these things can't happen. I just don't believe in trying to chart the unchartable. And one of the things that has been counted on are these gamma squeezes and short squeezes, possibly even. And what we saw was like something like I don't know, I saw a ridiculous figure, something like $2 trillion in premiums were collected on Friday. I mean, just absolute nonsense. And from my understanding, part of that was GME. I know the Reddit crowd apparently we're all talking about it, and I don't know if people were being encouraged. That sounds like collusion to me. Be careful with that. But it sounded like to me that people in the GME community were encouraging others to blow up the options chain, and they all sunk, right? Like they all got sunk. I mean, you talk about losing money. I mean, $2 trillion just gone, kaput. Your market makers and the people who are selling the calls, right? And buying the puts, like those are the people, the bigger institutions that are really running things right now. And it's very clear, like, and I just want to be really, really clear about this because I got just an absurd amount of negative feedback on Friday from people. And look, I'm not a financial advisor, okay? Like, that's not what I do for a living. I'm not certified to give financial advice. And the fact that I come on and I talk about these things, I do it because I want to help educate people and like give you some perspective, but also because I just happen to be the one to map out the fractal and put it out there first. And I don't mean that in like, oh, well, to disparage other people's efforts or to say that somebody else like Astro didn't already have a pretty good grasp on it. That's not what I mean. I just mean that like I mapped it, right? Back in like November or something and put it out there. And at that point in time, I don't think anyone had done that. Not the way that I did it anyways. And then people were asking me and encouraging me and telling me like, hey, you should just keep going and track this thing. And it became kind of this little hobby of mine and kind of blew up and turned into something that I really didn't intend for it to happen. So the reason I'm telling you that is because when people come and they say, hey, you got this wrong, I'm gonna kind of shrug my shoulders. Like, I don't actually take it personally. I mean, maybe it comes off that way because Twitter, you can't really show emotions very well, but I can't tell you the number of people that have just kind of tried to rub my nose in it. And I'm like, well, okay, like what, what do you want me to say? Like I was wrong. Like, okay, I'm not afraid of being wrong. Like to me, it's like, it's a study, it's an observational study. And yeah, like I want to get to the point where this stuff is predictive. And it already is predictive. Like we've predicted tons of moves. Like I don't know how else to say. But folks just pick what they want to pick, right? To pick on. So anyways, I digress. I don't want to get into that too much right now. All I'm saying is that the immense amount of negativity, like I don't find it to be worth a whole lot to me, and I'm kind of just getting tired of it. So, look, if you're here because you want to learn, great. If you're here because you want me to give you like silver ball predictions, or what is it called? Crystal ball predictions. I don't think a silver ball would work. I have silver on the mind. We're gonna talk a little bit of silver today. If you want crystal ball predictions, like this is not the place for you. I suggest you stop watching. And I'll wait. You can turn it off, go somewhere else. anyways, let's talk about AMC on Friday. So Friday, we did get our final, I think, one of our final springs. I keep saying that though, you know. I will say this is heavy volume. You can see that the push down was greater than that of December 13th. So to me, that's a signal, a good sign. Like that means that could be the main sell off. And if it is, then there's no reason to think that wasn't the bottom. All right. You see how this is the highest peak sell off? And up until that point, if you look at December 13th forward, the selling has actually sort of reduced. Like I know like the selling volume on the whole has been pretty steady and like heavy at times. Don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is like these peak values have been kind of going down on the whole. But this is a big deviation from that, and it busted out, right? And you can see that it's interesting because it follows a few pretty huge bullish peaks. So I find that to be indication of a bottom. Like the volume, you can see the threshold here. I know it's hard to see because this thing keeps getting in the way. But if we were to draw like a line and just look at volume, you can see that in recent days, it's increased quite a bit. And not only that, but buying and selling to some degree have increased a bit. Volatility is going up, right? And specifically, this push down was pretty huge. And then the buying up from that also pretty huge. Now, at the end of the day, they just kind of pinned it, and that's all there is to it. I posted about a couple different options that I thought maybe would occur. So this is a basic pattern for a spring fractal right here. And I saw this as the bridge. And if it's the bridge, and this is cliff over here and a peak over here, then the expectation was that this should arc up. And it was definitely an ascending accumulation with a push upward perhaps. But there is the other possibility, and it's always a possibility with these silly fractals because of the way that they iterate. There's a possibility that this actually breaks down again, because you see how this in and of itself right here, if you follow the orange markers, this is a little micro spring fractal on accumulation. Trade the top of the range, trade the lower range, go back up to the top. You start forming these weird cat ear things. This is not how the day ended, right? It actually looked like it was going to break up, and then it just sort of stopped moving. But yeah, sure, like right here, it could have broken down. And then this, we would say, no, this is actually a bigger one right down here on the bottom, and we wait for it to play out. That's still a possibility. I'm not going to say it's not. It's a possibility. But yeah, I mean, the end of the day was crazy. I think I measured, there was like no change in the price ultimately, but the last 60 minutes of the day, we had something like 700,000 volume traded. I don't know if I got this right on the money or what, but it was maybe a minute off, right? But you see how like that's 659. But my point is like it didn't go anywhere. They pinned it below this value here, and yeah, it just sat there. But look at the volume. I mean, you can tell here like somebody was like, no, this is not breaking out. Someone was getting eager beaver and trying to break out, and then someone else was like, no, not yet. So I think probably we're talking about, I mean, usually right up around the hour out in the day, you have to stop trade. You can stop trading options, right around an hour before close, I think, or 2 o'clock, something like that. But certainly somebody wanted it to stay below, and that's all there is to it. So in the end, when we're looking at this, this is kind of right in our pocket. There's a possibility on Monday that it could drop and form like a larger accumulation down here, fill out this region some. I don't think that's out of the question. The other possibility is that it runs up and hits the top here, creates a new peak, right? We accumulate in this region, this pocket right here. Okay, and then we get a spring fractal that drops us perhaps back down to here again for a double bottom. And that's just one option. The other option is that we never come back down here again. Like if this is ascending, and this is ascending, maybe then when we set up, you can see it's happened before here, right? And this is the same, this is the fractal that I'm following right here. All right. And when it comes back up, usually it comes back to about the peak previously. So it should come up to at least 1945. That would be my guess, at least, right? And if it were to go any higher, it would probably accumulate up here. I don't know why it would need to accumulate this region again. That's why I think you're going to see a big run up through this region, perhaps. And then, because that would make sense, right? To just skip over it. Just like here, it was already done. So they just skip over it and then they kind of go below it and accumulate below this region. So skipping over it, then perhaps go back below it. But this is all speculation, right? The only situation I can see where it stays down here longer is if, again, like this is a breaking point and it forms like a completely new spring down here, just like this one did. This one could have set up the same way this one did, right? But it didn't. It actually broke and stayed down. So it created not a segment. Well, in a way, it created a segmentation that should be filled on the way up. But in another sense, it's just an iteration. I mean, this could be a complete fractal in and of itself, right? It's just that this spring hasn't finished. So that's the iterative part. So going over this, very briefly, because I want to talk about some other things. So yeah, I'm not saying Monday is a coin toss. What I personally think, my opinion is that it's going to run back up and it's going to stay up here. And then we'll have to talk about what the spring might do. I think it's very possible, we'll see. It's very possible this looks like an ascending accumulation. And then it breaks down one more time to this lower region for a final spring. The only bearish option I can see right now is if that dip happens, it accumulates here and then a final dip down to like 14 or something happens. It could happen pretty fast, right? In like a day or so. That's kind of my bearish short-term scenario. But yeah, and actually touch the bottom of this, quasi trend line triangle thing. I will say, optimistically, we are seeing like, if you're looking at this the way it's been falling, this is pretty dramatic downward action. You can see it seems to be kind of curving around. You can almost draw like a perfect curve on here. It seems to be curving. And if you look at the short term, same deal. It's like, yeah, we got these lower lows, but didn't go down all the way, right, to this curve. So to me, that is bullish. That's a good thing, short term. All right, let's talk about silver again. Here's the chart, and here's how the day finished out, by the way. We'll come back to this chart in a minute, but you see how it looked like these were the cat ears, and I would have said that. And then it broke down, like this would have been the spring, but then it just sort of like went quickly through the sequence to another one and broke down again. Yeah, they were just pinning it. I think that's all there is to it. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. Because I actually think this is more likely, at least in my opinion, this is more likely what actually the finishing of this right here. And it should have just kept going, but they didn't let it, because they wanted it pinned below this price. Yeah, let's talk about silver, and then we'll come back to AMC and do the macro. So for silver, I wanted to talk about a couple charts. So I went to silver, and I looked at the comparison between silver's macro chart. So this is silver July 2020 to present, and AMC's two fractal examples of a spring that more or less goes sideways. All right, this spring is the one from recently. I believe this was from January 7th or 6th, right, all the way through 13th or 14th, where it finally broke down. But I also did one of this region, which is December 13th through the 17th. So both of these are the same fractal. You can see there's a lot of matching parts. And they do share similarities with some of these regions, for sure. There are some differences, okay? But it's important to note that they are the same fractal. They just played out a little differently. If I were picking one to just sort of compare to, I like this one. Now, does that mean that I think that this fractal will eventually break down? No, I think it just depends on the macro view, right? You can't take a micro and say, oh, well, this micro broke down and like rip it out of context and then say this is the same place. Like, no, that's not what's going on here, right? This is actually coming down, right? This is coming up. So not the same at all. That would be very, very silly. But what I will say is when you look at the sequence, very similar. I'm not going to walk through it with you. I mean, you can kind of just see it. It's almost like the same chart, right? And specifically, I want to look at this region because this is sort of what we're sitting in right now on AMC as well. And when I looked at silver, I looked at it as if I'd never seen an AMC chart before. I'd only ever seen this pattern. So I looked at it like, okay, I don't know what's going on with the macro and AMC. Let's pretend. And I'm going to just try my best to map what I think is happening here. And this is what I came up with. That basically this was your bowl, your bridge between the cliff and the peak, the two towers, right? And you're going to get those two inner towers as well. And so then this inner region right here would be the bridge of this micro. Just like there's a bridge here with a peak, right? Peak, across from it. Now this peak is weird looking, kind of ugly. Again, it's good to go back and forth and like look at the two different ones. In this case, you can see there it is. And this would be your sell-off right into a spring. So in this region, the spring happened way over here. It's like sideways. And it happened, you can see it, and then it pushed out. So is this a spring right here? Well, not really. It's actually the other side of it's the run up, right? It's the climb, as I call it, up to the midterm peak. And then you'll see it sort of go sideways here for a bit until the midterm spring, and then it'll finally get up, and that's what's going to cause the macro peak. But this is an ascending accumulation of sorts, and that's the way we'd want to think about it. Same here, ascending accumulation. You can see that the buying, in a lot of ways, it just outweighs the selling. That's why it's ascending, right? That's the whole point here. So this is kind of unique compared to like this whole thing, right? Which is fairly sideways. So within this larger spring fractal, you have another one down here that creates the bridge. And within that bridge, you also will have two towers and a bridge. It's not that confusing if you've been following along for a while. If you're brand new, just look at the pretty pictures, right? You can just see it, right? You can see, I mean, this area and this area, it's almost identical. It's almost spooky identical, right? And the way that we get down here with this drop and some of these liquidity spikes, just to sort of define the top. I mean, very, very uncanny at times. And the double bounce here, I mean, it's super strange stuff. But yeah, I mean, so what are we looking for then for the rest of silver? Well, we're looking for the macro peak. Then we'd be looking for, after that, it to settle down a bit. And then we would look for the cat ears to form. And it's hard to tell on this one where the cat ears are. They got really stretched out. This is one ear here. And then there's another ear that stretches like way over. I don't think it's going to look like that per se. This gets super stretched out. You can see here's a more compressed version. It's almost like somebody took this and went and just like pushed it in. You know, when you go from here to here, it's like somebody squished it together, right, with their fingers. You can see the difference. But yeah, so this is your cat ears. These look a lot like cat ears. But yeah, there's the flat top. This one's more pointed and actually has like three. It's basically like a head and shoulder type formation. So this is the way it could look. You know, after it finally breaks out, you get a sell off, right, to redefine the bottom, wherever that is. This is sort of an estimation of the bottom based on the curve. So maybe it's around $25. You get a push up all the way to, I don't know, 30, close to 30, maybe 31. Comes back down about halfway. That would be this region right here. All right, which is more than likely around like 27.50 or something. Goes sideways, up, down, and then perhaps it breaks out. Now that's the point at which you're going to want to look at it and say, yeah, that's the way it could go. Again, this is coming to silver with fresh eyes, like not knowing anything else about the stock, but just looking from here forward, what would I think this is setting up like? Now you might be saying, well, Booksy, does that mean we haven't even experienced the spring yet for AMC? That's a big what if question, because on the one hand, I would say yes, and on the other hand, I would say no. So one of the things that I presented in another video, and this is where we're going to start with the macro, is that this is in fact an entire sequence. And if this is an entire sequence, something like that, it's super weird looking, maybe more like this. I don't know. If this is an entire sequence, I think it's probably more the way I had it the first time. Where this is the break, this is the cliff, right? And then this is sort of your bottom, right? Your bridge is right here, but it went crazy. And it messed up. Yeah, it got really out of hand. So maybe this is more or less the bridge, right? But yeah, like I looked at this and I said, well, this to me looks like an ascending accumulation, and it looks a lot like our spring fractal that we've been talking about. So does that mean that basically this is in and of itself its own thing, and that after this break, we'll see that big push? So yeah, I mean, if you look at this, compare it to December 15th or 13th through the 17th, then the natural end is just boom, like straight up. That's the most bullish scenario that I have. But it's only one scenario. And this is what bothers me about a lot of the community at large right now, is that we assume that it has to do that because of the two previous moves. Like it's just going to do the same thing. It might. Okay, it depends a lot on gamma. It depends a lot on the short interest and the days to cover, things like that, right? That can affect how quickly the stock can move. But there's a possibility that this is not the schematic, right? So one of the things I looked at, and this is another one that would echo the bullish sentiment, and this spooked me a little bit, is that I looked back, because when I looked at what happened on Friday, and I know I'm hopping around, but we're talking about the macro now, okay? So we're going to look at just macro view and see what's going on. When I looked at what was going on, I have to look at this on the weekly, even though you won't get as much information, so I can fit it on my screen. Yeah, that to me is a dead ringer for what we're experiencing right now on the micro. Very interesting. And if you looked at that and you saw this, you might be like, oh no, it's going to pop up and then come right back down and so on and so forth. Well, it might do that. But we don't know for sure yet. And again, it's this idea of like, well, which is the cat ear, right? If this is the final cat ear and this is the actual whatever, like this is the first one, this is the second one, then it's possible, that this is what we're in store for. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. This is super bizarre looking, but it's a possibility. And then this would be your peak, your bridge, right here, and then you'd have like the cat ear 1, cat ear 2, and then the spring action. And yeah, we just saw one cat ear, like that's all we've seen. So it's complicated. I mean, this isn't simple. If this is where we are, quote unquote, right, in the sequence of things, and this is super convincing to me, just because it's like a dead ringer for it, right? If this is where we are in the scheme of things, and the whole point of this drop down here was to accumulate down in this lower region, then we've done that, right? We've accumulated this lower region. We've gone way beyond, and we're looking to move out of this range, right? At least beyond the previous high of $37. And like that's going to be sort of the new floor, and maybe even more like $50, right? Because we've already explored a lot of the 30 range. So you would expect that to happen here, right? To push up. I was just talking about that. So no matter what happens in this range, if you're interpreting like this, then it would be up eventually, okay? So that's the good news. The bad news is that I can't really chart this. I was trying to figure out a way to chart this, as best I could, and I just don't find it to be very easy. Something like this was sort of the best I came up with, and it doesn't look super convincing to me. I think the difference in volume makes this just very, very challenging. I mean, you look at this and you're like, whoa, the next ceiling is 270. And it's like, well, I don't know, maybe. Um, it's pretty clear to me that this wasn't as high as they intended it to go. And that if you're just looking at how high did this come up, right? When it came out of this bowl, within here, right before the sideways move and then the pump up, sideways move and then the pump up, like how far did it come up? Well, it only came up to the cliff. Where is our cliff on this one? Our cliff is like way down here. So I think the idea is that perhaps, and I mentioned this I think in another video, but perhaps like this whole region, the intention was not to come up that high. Maybe it was really just to, I can't even chart it here. But I think this is a fair assumption, is that perhaps this whole region was going to be set up a little lower. We talked about this with silver a bit because I showed you that trend line on silver in the last video. There's a trend line that seems to run right through it. And I think that it would have been much lower. And I think that probably, if you look at just where that trend line maybe was setting up, it may have been more like this. And this would mean that this region that we're currently in, the sideways downward region, would have been set up maybe over here, right around $9. That seems more likely to me. And that means that the ceiling here, the cliff, if you will, is actually more or less right here at about $20. Okay? So it's interesting to me now because we went so far above it that I'm wondering if the reason that they've brought us as low as they did is to get us back within this range, right? Not that they're going to take us down to 850. I don't think that's going to happen. But to get us back within this region so that when they launch, it's a little bit lower, right? It's a little closer to where they wanted us to begin with. And if you think about where the algo may have wanted us to begin with, if this had launched out, where would the top have been? Well, you know, it comes up usually about to the height of their previous top, sometimes even a little lower after it breaks out of these fractals, the ones we've been looking at. All right, we just saw one where the bridge pops out. It may come a little higher here, maybe, but not extremely higher. So I think at that point, yeah, like the next top we were looking at may have been like $40, right? That $30, $40 range, maybe $50. So consider that. The fact that they wanted us at like $50 and now we're way higher. And by the way, a lot of these institutions are bullish, right? But you take that same move now, that move to like 50. I know this is speculative. I understand that, but I'm trying to like just brainstorm with you and help you to understand. Like now you move from that same region where we are and it's going to 110, which keeps coming up, by the way, in a lot of my analysis. Okay. So if that's the case, right? And if you're looking at it that way, then you could easily sort of chart this like, oh, this is what they originally intended to do, was to take us to, let's say, right, this lower region here. And the original intention wasn't to be up this high. It actually kind of makes it a little bit easier to like understand, I think, the chart. And you wouldn't go back to this original peak anyways. You would go back to like here. Sometimes I do go back to the original peak, but really that would be like this region. I don't usually chart because it doesn't ever line up. It always goes down and then back up, just like down, back up a little bit. So yeah, I mean, but in this case, I guess you would have to because you see where it's going. Anyways, it doesn't really matter. The point is that then it makes it so that, okay, well, if the original intent was to go to 50, I mean, there you have it. I know that everybody was saying like, oh, well, this thing was trying to be shorted to death. And you could say that too. I mean, if you wanted to go to this peak, you could make that argument that somehow, oh, they were gonna. I don't see it now at this point. I think that this was an accumulation that wasn't supposed to go as high. That's what I honestly think. And this to me doesn't make a lot of sense. This downward movement, like it just doesn't. I think they were trying to get a new high by dropping it down this far. And then I think shorts and some short institutions just took it to the extreme and they overdid it. And then the apes stepped in and were like, nah, that's not going to happen. And now it's like the extreme the other way, right? So when we look at these charts, we have to sort of keep in mind, like, if that was the original intention, and this just is a theory, right? This isn't fact. We don't know. We don't know what the algo is thinking. Then maybe the intention to get us lower is really to break below this cliff again. Because you know what happened here when this went too high? It went back to this little cliff on this range. So if you were to look at, kind of blowing my own mind right now, I just made that connection. We talked about this in a previous video too. What is going on with all these lines? You see how it actually came back below? It passed back through underneath the cliff. And this is like a micro version of what we were just talking about. It went way beyond, it passed back below, right? And then it goes up above and starts getting out. It does an ascending accumulation. We might be seeing is something more or less like this. That's just trying to get us below the cliff, right? The cliff opposite. I think that's probable. And now we're finally like below it and we're trying to push our way back out. And once it happens, you're going to see more of this, where it's going to ascend, then perhaps go sideways for a bit and then break out. And that's what I want to talk about to finish the video today. So I've done up two scenarios. One is more bullish, one is more bearish. You'll notice that neither of these are particularly flat because I'm basing it on liquidity zones that haven't been discovered or explored very much. So this would be one that would look more or less like a big old SOS on the top of the range. And it would bounce between basically $40 and the $72 range. And you would explore regions in the 60s one more time. I don't think you would do a lot there, but the upper 60s, you'd pass into the lower regions of like 55 because we actually never, it looks like we explored it, but we actually didn't. Not as much as you would think. In this particular region up here, which is this region right here, you can see that we actually never really explored it very much. So I could see us going below it and above it and just kind of walking down through it in the sideways cat ear and then exploring more in the upper region and then coming low one more time for the spring and bouncing off of 39, which is basically this center line on this fractal. It's where you have the most volume, the most buy-in. That's my thought right now for a bullish scenario. Now, in terms of like short-term bullish, this would be the cat ears, right? On this fractal right here. In terms of short-term bullish, basically we're looking at, and I know it looks really weird, but we're looking at all of these little arc patterns, okay? And these arc patterns are basically just patterns of that we see in the stock whenever it goes through. So maybe I need to show an example of that. I don't have a good example of it right now. Well, you'll have to refer back to like some other schematics, but basically it's like when you leave, and I guess we saw it with the silver, when you leave the original trading range, you come back down, you come into this S pattern, and that's what causes the bridge explosion. So that's what I'm mapping out. So what I'm trying to do is basically provide like, okay, this is the real double top bottom. This would be your double bottom down here. You would have, you know, a sideways action with that spring, just like we're seeing, where it would kind of look like it's going to break out of, and then you would push up. And I'm doing it in regions like you can see here. I'm trying to do it in these pocket regions where I think like this is where the most trading is going to happen. So they're going to get up there and trade, come back through, maybe get a spring, and then move forward. And this is a very bullish scenario. This is the scenario where this is our true bottom and we don't need to come back. And for the timeline, I know this says March or something, or February for big moves. This kind of lines up with what we're seeing in the options chain right now, but I didn't do that on purpose. I just kind of was eyeballing this and just looking at what I think would be the quick momentum of this if this were bullish. And then it would cool off a bit. And basically by June, right? Again, cycles, I guess. You basically by June have another run, the real run. So this would be an interesting way to do it, and it would follow everything that we've seen so far, including sort of this like macro view of sort of having these if that line that we drew in silver the other day coming through here would basically be tested on this peak, more or less. There is a bullish scenario, and then there's also more of a neutral scenario, which I didn't draw. In the neutral scenario, you would basically just take this arc and flatten it. The reason that I don't think that's going to happen is because there's no reason for us to retrade in this region. And once you do this, once you flatten this, it's like, why would you want to spend more time in the exact same region? Like, you wouldn't do that. The composite emu doesn't want to go back here again. It's already done everything it needs to do there. Volume was exhausted, right? Instead, it's going to be looking at this upper region or lower region. So there's two major options here. One is very bullish, one is very bearish, and neither is necessarily wrong at this point in time, because this stock moves like a robot. All right. I know that we've talked a lot about, there's artificial intelligence in the world, and maybe this thing is like, this quantum computer is smart and all this stuff. Well, it is, but it also isn't. Like, you remember that movie like I, Robot? And the movie, the main character, Will Smith, like just doesn't like robots because reasons, and he actually has like a robot arm. And the robot in the movie, Sonny, is thought of as like this highly artificially intelligent creature. But really, like, what gives him intelligence, or that signals to the audience that he has intelligence, is his ability to deceive, which is kind of weird, and then like not follow his own rules. So when he no longer follows his own rules, his own programming rules, they're like, oh, he's super smart, right? That's how the audience is supposed to be like, oh, he's not like the other robots, like he can break the rules. And then he becomes this weird like Messiah character and all this other stuff. I'm not going to get into that. It's a cool movie. It had some problems, but I kind of liked it. And one of the things that stands out to me, though, is this idea of like breaking rules. And I think that we've been talking about this algo like it's breaking its own rules, and it's not. It's never breaking its own rules, because its rules are based on the data that's available, and it has specific points. I just talked about it in the last video, those breakout points, right? Where it's testing for certain things, and at any given moment, it could change, and it doesn't matter, because you can take this fractal and like slide it along wherever you want, right? It's this infinite loop. And so what's bizarre about this fractal is that, yes, it has the ability to sort of change direction at any time if the market conditions are right. And I think that this particular bleed down, it wasn't predestined, perhaps not. I think that there's a point here right around like $21 where if you look at other fractals of this nature, it looks like the natural turning point. But then if you look at where we are now, you're kind of like, okay, well, maybe it's going to do it again. And then you would just say, no, this is just a previous whatever, right? Or it's like, it never breaks. It's always fine. And that's the thing about the fractal that's both good and bothersome. It's good because you can always sort of go back and relook at it, re-examine it. But it's also frustrating because it means that you can't always anticipate the breakout point, right? You can't always anticipate the turn. You have to be willing to say, okay, well, the market conditions are bad, so I think that more than likely it's not going to just start turning right now. And you look at all the other stocks and you can kind of have this aggregate view. But yeah, I mean, as a result, then it's like, well, the possibilities are open. Both of these are possibilities. It doesn't have to do one or the other. Because if it gets to this point, and specifically there's one spot I'm going to look at, and that's basically $40. And if this is the peak at $40, then hands down, I believe that we're going to come back down. I cannot see us like trading sideways in this region right here, unless there's just an incredible amount of buying from retail. But I almost guarantee you, if it goes to like right about 45, right, and then it starts dropping, and this is in February, it's same timeline basically as the previous one, then you can expect to come back down, and we may even then at some point get a real spring that goes lower than where we are now. And if you look at that from a Wyckoff perspective, it looks fine. Like, it doesn't look anything wrong, right? It looks like it's always meant to be. Just like the previous one, it looked right. This is also right, okay? Both of these would work. And this one in particular, I don't know, there's something about it. I just feel like one is bearish, one is bullish. Both end in the same thing. And you might be thinking, well, Booksy, is it possible that this thing just keeps going down? Well, if it did drop below this particular region right here, this 14 region, it would go really hard down. Yes. But do I think it will? Probably not. I mean, look at the volume here. This is as solid a wall as you're going to get, in my opinion. And we've already gap filled. So at this point, there are other gaps, but I mean, there's no reason, right, to assume that just because somebody copied and pasted a bars pattern that goes below, like, that's not how stocks work. So, right, in iRobot, the idea is like, oh, they can deceive you. And it's that wink. And in the movie, he like winks at Will Smith or something. And Will Smith's like, oh, I figured it out. He's really not a bad guy, right? And he works together with him, right? At that point, I guess his prejudice is no longer there. But the point is like, we get those little winks and nods sometimes, and that's what kind of trips us up. But the program isn't broken. It's not changing. It's just because of the way this thing works, it's able to sort of shift whenever it needs to. And that's very frustrating, but it's also not super unusual. And I also don't think it means that there are certain things that are not going to happen ever. Like, like predestined, so to speak. Like the move down here, I think, yeah, like once 21, this didn't cause a push up. This is the moment right here. When we saw that, we should have known, like, okay, it's going to gap fill, and a lot of people did, right? And that's when I was changing my tune, and other people were changing their tune. But until that point, again, the fractal is intact. It's fine. It's still intact. All right? It's like, it shifted over. And so then you look at it and you say, okay, well, there are these key pivotal moments that we're going to have to find. And if the goal here, and it is for me, if the goal here is to trade long-term, then yeah, like we should be able to say these are the pivotal moments. So anyways, I wanted to share this with you today. I probably went a little long on the video, but whatever. Hopefully you enjoyed it and you got something out of it. I'm still looking at the comparisons with silver. I'm also looking at this macro view, and if you're wondering about all this stuff that's going on in here, what I'm doing is trying to map out the different S-curves, the layers. So there's like one here that's really small. It's a yellow one. There's one here that's blue. There's one here that's orange. Those are the main ones, the main 3 layers. And then I'm looking at the shapes within those. I'm filling out the shapes according to what typically happens in this S-curve, and then doing it on the micro so that it fits the macro, and then the midterm so that it fits the macro. So I'm trying to do it in a more intelligent way so that I get a bit more of an accurate mapping. However, in terms of timing, there's no way to time this, so not really. I'm looking at it based on proportion, essentially. But yeah, sure, like we could go straight up if this is actually, that's the most bullish example, right? If this is actually like a full-on ascending accumulation and we really haven't seen the peak, but we're about to. I don't think that's the case at this point. I think it's more likely we're going to do some sideways stuff first, but we'll see. I'm happy to be wrong if it just goes straight up. I just don't think that, like, I think what's more likely is one of these two things than just a move straight up. And I think that's based on what we've seen so far. But that's my opinion. It's not financial advice. And yeah, I hope you guys have a good one. I will talk to you later.